Act 2020, ticket touting offence, exceptions for use of internet, etc. Scotland Regulations 2020. Can I welcome Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, to the meeting. The Cabinet Secretary is joined by Lucy Carmichael, the Bill Team Leader, and Ninian Christie, the Solicitor of the Scottish Government. I will shortly invite them to make a brief opening statement, after which we will move to questions. If any member wishes to ask a question, please type R in the chat box and I will bring you in. And I would now like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and for the opportunity to speak to the committee today. As you may recall, the committee was due to meet on the 26th of March to consider the ticket touting regulations associated with the Euro 2020 Act. However, the regulations were withdrawn following UEFA's announcement on the 17th of March that as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, the championships would be postponed until June and July 2021. Since then, event partners in Scotland have worked together to complete the process of reconfirming Glasgow's host city status for 2021, and UEFA announced this week, following an executive committee meeting, that indeed all 12 cities have recommitted to hosting. In light of the rescheduling of the championships, my letter of the 11th of May to the committee set out details of the primary legislation that was required to amend the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act 2020, which will ultimately ensure that there is appropriate commercial rights protection for UEFA and its sponsors in order to meet the requirements to host matches in Glasgow. The Coronavirus No. 2 Scotland Act has subsequently allowed for the necessary amendments to be made. It changes the dates of the championship period, the definition of championship and the repeal date, and also corrects a European Convention on Human Rights compliance issue with an exception to the ticket touting offence for auctions of match tickets where the proceeds are given to charity. As the committee are aware, work to correct this issue had been underway earlier this year in the form of a remedial order. This too was disrupted by the coronavirus outbreak and postponement of the championship to 2021. UEFA has announced that tickets it has already sold will remain valid for the rescheduled event, and for that reason we felt it was particularly urgent to make the changes through the Coronavirus Act in order to be able to bring the ticket touting offence into force as swiftly as possible. The ticket touting regulations laid on the 1st of June are consistent with the illustrative regulations that were shared with the committee in October 2019, with only minor changes to improve consistency or clarity. The regulations are also consistent with regulations prepared under the Glasgow Commonwealth Games Act 2008. Subject to parliamentary approval, the regulations specify circumstances in which making facilities available in connection with electronic communications or the storage of data is or is not capable of constituting the touting offence. In particular, the regulations set out when the mere conduit, caching or hosting will not constitute the offence. These are the mechanisms used by internet providers for online temporary display of and or storage information. The regulations also set out conditions that must be met before the offence can be enforced against a person based in another European Economic Area state who provides internet-type services. Scottish Government officials have worked closely with event partners on the proposals for the regulations, and we are determined to support fair access to tickets so that as many fans as possible can enjoy the matches as part of the championship. Demand for tickets both in Glasgow and in other host cities is expected to exceed the number of tickets that will be available. By prohibiting the touting of match tickets, it is anticipated that this will act as a deterrent to touts who would seek to profit potentially significantly from resale of tickets, provided a basis for both preventative and punitive action in the event of any breach. As the committee is aware, the Championship as a whole presents a significant economic opportunity for Scotland, and I believe it will be an important step in our recovery from the current pandemic. Hosting a major international event as part of our recovery from the pandemic will provide a great opportunity for Scotland to demonstrate that we are open for business and further enhance our reputation as a world-class host of major events. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and certainly the championships are something we can all look forward to. Can I open by asking you, have information companies expressed any concern to Scottish ministers that they could fall foul of the touting offence through hosting or storing information related to an act in breach of the touting offence?
We've not received comments in relation to the illustrative ticket touting regulations that were shared with the Parliament back in October 2019. The regulations, as I've set out, followed the precedent set by ticket touting regulations made for the Glasgow Commonwealth Games that took place in 2014. They operated well in practice. They themselves were also subject to public consultation. Enforcement of the ticket touting offence in the 2020 Act is an operational matter for Glasgow City Council and Police Scotland. However, we want to continue to raise awareness of the issue as part of our engagement alongside event partners. But to your point about have there been any concerns raised by those information companies, no, none have been raised.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question from Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I just wondered if the Cabinet Secretary had any views on the concern it might be quite a cumbersome process and it could act, would it be an effective deterrent? The cooperation precondition, the way in which we have to interact with EEA states, if there is an issue, has led to some concerns that this is a cumbersome and slow process. And is there any moves being taken to counter that?
So we're required as Scottish ministers to include these conditions affecting enforcement action to ensure, as you pointed out, ensure compliance with EU law, specifically Article 3 of the Electronic Commerce Directive 2000. And I think you're alluding to the point that the requirements mean that the host and indeed the member state have to pursue issues first before it can be referred under that area. So we don't think that the process is too slow to act as a deterrent. Providers will be made aware that action can and will be taken where appropriate, either certainly initially from the Scottish enforcement action, but also by the host EEA state where else. I've indicated that it will be Glasgow trading standards, and also Police Scotland who would be the enforcers. And because this is an important issue, we've dealt with it previously in relation to the Commonwealth Games, these provisions, we don't think that there should be any issue in enforcing that. The fine, as you know, will be £5,000. And it's important, I think also, if I can maybe make this point as well, the committee, I want to reassure the committee that although the Euro 2020 Act will be repealed on the 31st of December 2022, the operation of Section 17 of the Interpretation and Legislative Reform Act 2010 means that this repeal will not affect a liability to a penalty for a championship offence under the bill, which is committed before the repeal. So again, in looking at what's required, we've tried to make sure everything's in place in anticipation of where we'll be next year. But on your point, will it be slow? No, our intention is not to be, but we have to follow the procedures.
Thank you very much. No other member has indicated that they wish to ask a question at this stage, so we shall move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion S5M 21917 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary on the approval of the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act 2020 ticket touting offence, exceptions for use of internet, etc. Scotland Regulations 2020. Before I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak and move the motion, if any member wishes to make a contribution again, please type R into the chat box and I will bring you in. And I'd like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and to move the motion. Secretary.
Convener, I just want to say, as you've indicated, that the UEFA Championships will be a great opportunity for us to bounce back, and I think it's important that it demonstrates Scotland at its best. We are a welcoming nation. We want to be open to the world, and I think football, as you know, can unite the world in lots of different ways, and to host games and part of the championships in Glasgow is going to be a fantastic opportunity. But we obviously have to get our technical regulations in place. So therefore, Convener, at the appropriate point, you can invite me to move, if that's what you're doing, to move the motion.
Yes, I'm inviting you to move the motion. Yes.
I move that the committee accept the motion to approve the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act 2020 ticket touting offence, exceptions for use of internet, etc. Scotland Regulations 2020.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated that they wish to make any comments. The question is that motion S5M 21917 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be agreed. If any member disagrees, please type N in the chat box and we will move to a vote. I'll just give members a couple of seconds. No member has indicated that they are opposing the motion. Therefore, the motion in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is agreed, and the committee recommends that the UEFA European Championship Scotland Act 2020 ticket touting offence, exceptions for use of internet, etc. Scotland Regulations 2020 is approved. The committee will shortly report to Parliament on the instrument. Are members content to delegate to the Deputy Convener and myself to sign off the final report? Please indicate in the chat box if you're not happy with that approach. Thank you. Before we move on to the next agenda item, I will allow a short pause to allow the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution Europe and External Affairs to join us. Thank you very much. The next item of business this morning is an evidence session on the future relationship negotiations between the European Union and the UK Government. Can I welcome Michael Russell, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. He is joined by David Barnes, Deputy Director for EU Exit Strategy and Negotiations with the Scottish Government. As always, I would be grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible, and I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your question or provide an answer. Before we move to questions, I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. Given the UK Government's continuing refusal to seek an extension to the Brexit transition period and the impossibility, absolute impossibility of preparing for as yet unknown new relationship at the end of the year, I am, and I think we all should be, deeply worried about the implications for Scotland, the period that we are now entering. The fourth round of negotiations finished on the 5th of June, and it is fair to say that both sides agreed that no progress had been made. That's not just because of the pressures of a ridiculous deadline set a long time ago in different circumstances, but because these negotiations are actually blocked on fundamental issues of governance, issues of the level playing field, issues of fisheries, and a number of others. And there is no way that technical finessing is going to deal with that. The Prime Minister met the European Commission President, the European Council President, and the European Parliament President on Monday this week. All that could be announced thereafter was the continuation of talks into August, an intensification, a word, of course, that was used about discussions with the Scottish and Welsh governments as long ago as January 2017. There simply isn't the time to negotiate, ratify, and then implement a new agreement. And at the same time, discussions are continuing on the implementation of the withdrawal agreement, with some considerable doubt as to whether the UK is moving in the right direction at the right pace. The UK-EU Joint Committee, whose role is to oversee this, met for the second time on 12th of June. The Commission Vice President, who is the co-chair, said that the UK must meet all the requirements of the Northern Ireland Protocol rigorously and effectively, his own words, including the implementation of all checks and controls for goods entering Northern Ireland from the UK, from GB. Despite the importance of the Joint Committee decisions to implementation in Scotland, including in devolved areas, the Scottish Government is not cited on these discussions. Neither the Scottish Government nor the other devolved governments have provided with anything like a meaningful opportunity to influence matters on the protocol or any other matter, and Scotland's interests have scarcely been considered at all by the UK Government. The Joint Ministerial Committee on EU Negotiations is supposed, under its terms of reference, to oversee the negotiations. But since January, the JMCEN has met virtually only once, on May the 21st. On the 19th of May, the UK published its draft legal text for the negotiations. They were shared with the Scottish Government less than 24 hours before publication, with no opportunity to amend. And this attitude from the UK Government, which has deteriorated even further with the new administration that came into power in December, is what led last Friday to the Scottish and Welsh ministers declining to take part in a scheduled video conference with UK ministers. In these circumstances, I have to say it's very difficult, indeed it's next to impossible, to ensure that Scotland's voice is heard in what are the most important constitutional negotiations for decades. I'm happy to answer questions on that, and I'm sorry I can't be more cheerful.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And if I could just open you mentioned that you can't be more cheerful, and no personal offence, but you're not often cheerful when you come before this committee to talk about Brexit, so it's perhaps no surprise. But given the comments that you have made in the past about lack of engagement with the devolved administrations, why was it last week that you boycotted the conference with the UK? I mean, what was the trigger, given that, perhaps this kind of behaviour from the UK is something that you've grown used to? What was exceptional this time?
Well, I think there are two issues in here. One was the actual circumstances of Friday, in which the two First Ministers in Wales and Scotland wrote to the Prime Minister saying, please do not rule out an extension. This is absolutely vitally important. Both Wales and Scotland and the Northern Ireland Assembly, the Northern Ireland administration does not have a position because of a difference between the major players, although I have to say Michelle O'Neill, who was present at the Joint Committee on Friday, was absolutely unequivocal in her condemnation of the decision not to seek an extension. But the two First Ministers wrote. And at the same time, Michael Gove, knowing that there was a meeting later that day, quite clearly and deliberately ruled out any possibility of an extension definitively. Now, this seemed to both Jeremy Miles and myself simply to confirm that it did not matter what the Scottish or Welsh governments, the Scottish or Welsh parliaments, the Northern Ireland Assembly said, it would simply be ignored. We were due to have an occasional series of meetings with the Paymaster General, who I have to say has tried to behave as well as possible during these matters, but she's been left with an impossible task. She has to carry away requests from the devolved administrations to the Chancellor of the Duchess of Lancaster, Michael Gove, and then bring back usually dusty answers. And we just felt on Friday that we had to show that we were not prepared to go on with this charade any longer. I think the second one was to say, and we said this in the letter we sent to Michael Gove on Friday, there has to be at the very minimum a reset of these discussions, a complete review of how they are going forward. And because we try to be constructive people, we disagree profoundly with what is taking place, but we try to be constructive. We put to Michael Gove a list of changes that he needs to bring into place in order to have any chance of having meaningful negotiations. And we start with the honouring of what the actual remit of the Joint Ministerial Committee on European Negotiations is. And if you'll permit me, I just want to tell you that because it's really important. This was agreed between all the government in 2016, and it was the basis on which we entered into discussions, accepting that we didn't want Brexit, but this is a basis. And the JMCEN is meant to discuss each government's requirements for the future relationship with the EU. seek to agree a UK approach to and objectives for Article 50 negotiations. That didn't happen. Provide oversight of negotiations with the EU. Provide oversight, it says, to ensure as far as possible that outcomes agreed by all four governments are secured from these negotiations, and discuss issues stemming from the negotiation process which may impact upon or have consequences for the UK government, the Scottish government, the Welsh government, or the Northern Ireland executive. These are clear. That is not happening, and has not happened for some considerable time. Has been raised at almost every meeting. So we say that has to be recognised of what we're there for. The JMCEN must be given precedence again. So it must be meeting regularly. We've said weekly presently when these negotiations are going on. That it should be slotted in, these meetings should be slotted in a way that we can talk about and have oversight of negotiations. There should be a meaningful way which Task Force Europe, headed by David Frost, comes and discusses things, not in a pro forma way, not telling us things that we've already read in the newspapers, which is what actually happens. We had a ministerial briefing yesterday from the Paymaster General, and I have to say that the report from Task Force Europe had nothing in it that had not already been read in the newspaper. So that has to happen. We have to make sure that there is an agenda for these meetings which gives real information and involves us in these discussions. And there has to be an intention to try and do some of the things we need to happen. I'll give you an example. On the issue of programs such as Horizon Europe and the Erasmus Plus scheme, we have said, Wales and ourselves and Northern Ireland have all said, that if the UK does not wish to participate in this, they must bring to the table the arrangements and requests for the devolved administrations to take part in their schemes if we so wish. That issue has been evaded meeting after meeting and is not happening. And the Task Force Europe know that that is what they would have to do if we're to get a way in which the devolved administrations can continue to take part in those schemes, and they're not doing it. And I don't think they have any intention of doing it, but they simply will not answer the questions on it. So we need to get back to a situation where there is actual discussion, actual oversight, and actual action.
Thank you very much for that briefing on your letter. Can you indicate just quickly, is your letter going to be published?
I'm quite happy to publish it. It has gone jointly gone from myself and Jeremy Miles. It went yesterday. There was, as I say, a ministerial discussion yesterday afternoon. We received no answer to it, though Penny Mordaunt, to be fair to her, said that she would discuss it with Michael Gove.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, obviously things that have reached an impasse. You talked about the legal text and not seeing them until 24 hours beforehand. If you had an opportunity to feed in to those legal texts, how would you have changed them?
Well, the one text at which there was any discussion was the one on justice and security. The Scottish, it was necessary to involve the Lord Advocate because he has an independent position as a prosecutor. So he was able to point out that Scots law said certain things, and was, for example, that he was responsible in his independent role as ensuring, as being responsible for a great deal of the law and the administration of extradition. Now, in each of the areas, there are things in which we could say, and we can go through these by giving you a briefing. In each of the areas, we could say, actually, we think this should happen. Now, there are some areas we say we disagree entirely with this. These texts are the texts which should be operating what I call the three-rung model, and I think I've discussed that with the committee before, so I won't go into great detail. But these are the texts that should have allowed us, first of all, to have a discussion about what should be in the text. That's the first stage. Once there was an agreement of what should be in the text, those should be the basis on which a negotiating position was based. And then if we could agree that position, we should be involved, if not in actual negotiation, then in supporting negotiation. But instead, these texts are just delivered as finished items, sometimes with errors in them, and that's simply it, they go and be negotiated. So we have people who are expert in each area who can go and influence that. And that's not happening. And that is the issue. Now, in each of the areas, we have put ideas forward. We've tried to discuss them. And you don't get anywhere. I mean, there's a question about what detail would you like in this? You say what detail you would like. And then nothing happens.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Claire Baker.
Thank you, convener. The need for an extension is one of the big issues year. And in my view, it would be a pragmatic decision to take that approach, given the UK and Europe are in the grip of a COVID crisis. But can I ask, over the last few weeks, we've had evidence. We've had Philip Rycroft and Professor Hall last week. They have both expressed a view that a deal can be reached in the timescales, and they're optimistic about a deal being reached by October. Do you think a deal could be reached this year? And if there is a deal, what kind of deal would it be that we could get by the end of the year?
It's a very good question. I mean, what the UK is asking for in any case is what you would call a low deal. I mean, it's very, very far away from anything that we even envisaged a year ago they would settle for. And essentially, it is the most rudimentary basic free trade agreement that they're looking for, with no restrictions upon the UK and able to do anything it likes. And it's unrealistic, in my view, to think that that is something that the EU will sign on to. But by changes on both sides, you probably could get some sort of really unsatisfactory low deal, which is almost as damaging as a no deal. But even if you could get that, you would then have to implement it. Now, so you've got to look at consequences and the sequencing. The consequences of that deal would be damaging and bad for virtually every sector of the Scottish economy. In fact, I will say every sector. I think even on the fisheries side, which is the only area that the UK government will talk about in Scotland, but even on the fisheries side, I think if you were to get a deal, it would be an unsatisfactory deal from the Scottish fishing perspective, let alone from any other perspective. But even if you get that deal, you've then got a huge amount of work to put in place to implement that deal. I mean, let us, for the sake of argument, assume that this intensification of work was to produce the outline of a deal by the end of August. I think that is the hint from the UK government that they think that can be achieved. I'm sceptical, and people in Europe are sceptical, without a huge change on the UK's part. But let's assume that's the case. That leaves you 4 months to ratify and to implement all these changes. For example, to get all the new customs officers that would be required, because there's an admission they are required. They've set up, I think, the UK, the biggest customs training school in the world. There will be more customs officers than I think there are employees of the European Union, which should give you pause for thought. But even in those circumstances, you would not have time to do this well or properly. Moreover, the consequences of that deal, this low deal, will continue to be poor for every year thereafter. And the complete flim-flam we're hearing about trade deals with New Zealand and Australia would also be exposed to what it is. I noticed, I think it's an independent newspaper today, which actually publishes the government's own assessment, the economic impact of the New Zealand trade deal that they are looking for. And it is close to zero, that economic impact. And indeed, in some scenarios, it is actually going to diminish GDP. And for example, in Scotland, the issue of the trade in lamb will be a huge issue. So if they can do a deal, it will be a terrible deal. If they can't do a deal, it will be a no deal, which will be even worse, but both are not good. And I don't believe they can implement it. And then let us look at scrutiny. I mean, not only is there a capability issue of delivering, I mean, one of the problems I think that lies in these difficulties between the 4 nations of the UK, it's not just deliberate policy from the UK government, though I believe it is that. It is also the massive impact and pressure on all governments of COVID and trying to juggle that along with Brexit. So in those circumstances, there's capability and scrutiny. What scrutiny opportunities would there be for that deal if it was reached in the end of August, beginning of September, and then it would take a long time to ratify, it would take certainly a couple of months to ratify. How could that properly be investigated or scrutinised, and particularly with the pressure on parliaments, given the circumstances we're in? It makes no sense. This is only being pushed because it's being pushed ideologically, as an ideological obsession, and to favour a very few people. And some of those people will make money out of it. This is a disgrace. It's a democratic disgrace, and it's a disgrace that we are being pushed in this direction.
Thank you. The other evidence we heard last week was from Ali Renison from the Institute of Directors. And while she didn't give a view on what type of deal could be reached by the end of the year, she did stress the need for, if there was to be a deal and a new phase started on the 1st of January, there would be a need for an implementation phase or an adjustment period, and said that's what businesses were asking for. And what discussions are the Scottish Government engaging with businesses in Scotland, if we are looking at the reality of a deal reached by the end of this year, what the implications are and how that can be managed during an implementation phase?
One of the real problems at the present moment, I don't need to tell you this, one of the real problems is that business is absolutely focused on COVID and COVID recovery. Most businesses are, many businesses are fighting for their lives, and they're doing so and surviving really with government help of various types. And their bandwidth is not wide enough to consider the implications of Brexit. And I've heard this from a range of businesses, which are very worried indeed about the impact of Brexit, but simply cannot think carefully or constructively about it because of the COVID difficulties they have. Carolyn Fairbairn, the outgoing, I think, CBI chief, made this point 2 weeks ago in a piece for Political, that this is, adding a huge burden to an absolutely massive burden. If you accept, the precise figures I don't think are clear. If you accept this is the worst recession, certainly of our lives, and possibly, I think the Financial Times, the headline says the first one for 300 years. If you accept that that is the case, what type of insanity would then lead you to suppose that you could pile on an additional hit to GDP? The only reason for doing it would either be because ideologically you're fixated by this, or because you think you can hide the damage of Brexit under further damage and worse damage being done by something else. Both of those are possible explanations. Perhaps both of them are true.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to a question from Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, you've already touched upon the situation regarding the intergovernmental relations that exist or don't exist. This has been a long-running problem within these islands. And one of the big challenges that we face, you just mentioned this a moment ago regarding the economic situation that we're all about to face. Well, we're faced with COVID, but we're also about to face potentially with a no-deal Brexit. And you also touched upon a few moments ago regarding the report that was published, the negotiating position from the UK government that the Scottish government only received it 24 hours beforehand. So are you indicating to the committee this morning that the Scottish government and potentially the other devolved nations within the UK have had no opportunity to actually input into the UK government's negotiating position with the EU?
I'm indicating to you that there has been no meaningful opportunity to do so. There has been lip service paid to the issue of involving the devolved administrations, in my view, but there has been no meaningful attempt to either to involve, to listen, or to listen to. And there's certainly been no evidence that whatever we have said has made any difference at all.
The GMC process, obviously you've got the GMCEN, but and other ones as well that have existed. Do you think that they are fit for purpose? Do you think that they actually can work? Do you think that there's any type of way forward for them to have any form of meaningful existence?
There has been no other part of the JMC process operating. Well, there has been no JMC plenary, which is the only other part that is still operating. There's been no JMC plenary since Johnson came to power. Indeed, I think the last JMC plenary would be in December 2018. I need to check that, but I'm pretty sure in my mind that there was a Christmas one in December 2018. So for the best part of a year and a half, there's been no JMC plenary. I mean, there was a longer period without one after 2014. No, I mean, nobody who has studied the JMC process believes it is fit for purpose. I mean, no academic, no parliamentary committee here or at Westminster or in Wales or in Ireland has believed for a long time that it is fit for purpose. And one of the ways to deal with this, as you know, was to have an intergovernmental review. And the JMC accepted, and this would be a JMC plenary, so we are talking about sometime, I think May 2018 actually, maybe 2 years ago. It could be earlier than that actually. Accepted there should be a review of the intergovernmental relationship. This has not yet produced anything. the gestation period for this has been longer than an elephant, and nothing has happened. In January this year, before the lockdown, we believed up until the day of the JMC-EN meeting, which was held in Cardiff on the 29th, I think the 29th of January, we believed that we would receive proposals from the UK government drawn up by Michael Gove, which were going through sign-off by his colleagues to move this on, and nothing happened. We didn't see it. For some reason, I presume some government department objected to it. We never saw it. Now, I think, I raised this at the JMC in May, and there was an agreement that the 4 countries would sit down and talk about restarting this process. But, I think you just have to accept that nothing's going to happen in this because, we brought to the table lots of ideas. I mean, I want independence. I think I think what I'm describing to you just illustrates why that is essential. But, we have not failed to bring to the table ideas to move things on. Sometime, there's been so long in this, but I think sometime in 2019, but it may well actually have been in 2018, actually, both Mark Drakeford, who was then my counterpart, but is now Welsh First Minister, and I, gave substantive lectures to the Institute for Government in London, talking about the way in which intergovernmental relations had to change. Now, the Welsh Government and ourselves disagree on the constitutional destination, but, we have been able to work together to move forward and to bring ideas to the table. And, the Welsh Government believe and have made it clear that they think that sovereignty should be held by each of the nations and willingly shared, not at the present moment that, there's this fiction of sovereignty in Parliament, that in actual fact this should be what happens. And we've brought ideas to the table. We've talked about them. We've published about them. We have zilch from the UK government. There is no commitment to change, no matter what is said. There's just not going to be. Because I believe there is a deep-rooted hostility to devolution and a view of the supremacy of Westminster, which cannot be challenged. And I think that is the core issue. And those two things are incompatible. And they're not going to bring to the table anything meaningful as far as I can see, because that would contradict the position that they hold. So I think you draw your own conclusions from that.
Thank you very much. We now move to Patrick Harvey to be followed by Gordon Hurst.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. My first question follows on quite smoothly from the discussions about the GMC itself, but after that first gap, the GMC plenaries, the GMC-EN was established. So, there was some creation of a new mechanism to deal with the current situation. It was supposed to seek to agree a UK approach to the negotiations and provide oversight. Last week, Philip Rycroft said that in relation to that remit, it is probably fair to say that it has not operated entirely to the satisfaction of all those around the table. Delicately put, I think. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us whether it has achieved any aspect? I'm sure that he has a long list of areas where he would like it to have done more or to be more effective, but has there been any aspect at all of the process where Scotland's voice or the others around the table have been heard, have had an influence and have changed the UK government's negotiating position? Has it achieved its remit to any extent, even on a single issue?
I think that's an entirely fair question. I would like to think that there had been a purpose to it, particularly in its earlier incarnations. I think there was a greater attempt to square the circle. And I think what we're talking about here is the difficulty of squaring a circle. I think there was a greater attempt to do so in the early days, particularly, I have to say, with the involvement of both, particularly with Damien Green's involvement, which I thought was constructive and stripped away a lot of the difficulties that had existed. But in terms, we know, for example, that if you look at the 4 points of the remit, and I do think Philip Mycroft's comment was very civil service, it has to discuss each government's requirements for the future relationship with the EU. Well, you could say that it's done that, because there has been discussion, endless discussion. But you then look at outcomes, seek to agree a UK approach to and objectives for Article 50 negotiation. The committee never saw the Article 50 letter. It never discussed the approach that was taken. There was again a lot of discussion, but at the end of the day, it had no effect there. Provide oversight of negotiations, the third point, with the EU to ensure as far as possible that outcomes agreed by all four governments are secured from these negotiations. No. I mean, there has been no oversight. I mean, I don't think David Frost would regard himself as being overseen by the JMCEN, and there's certainly no meaningful reporting. It'd be an interesting question, but I think you'd get a civil service answer, but I'm absolutely certain that he would reject that fact. Interestingly and constitutionally, the only oversight of David Frost is from the Prime Minister. So, David Frost stands in a very strange position in this, and I think that is one of the questions that needs to be asked. Why is an official operating in that way and with the language he's operating with, which I think we should take exception to? And finally, discuss issues stemming from the negotiation process which may impact upon or have consequences to the UK government. Well, I mean, that's the heart of the matter. That we shouldn't get to that point, because at point 3, we should be changing the things that are going to damage. The potential for it to come to a positive outcome was there, because we went into it, the Welsh certainly went into it, with a view that we could compromise on the issues, for example, of single market and customs union access, that would allow the UK to get what it wanted, and we would get a compromise on terms of Brexit. Increasingly, as the UK's position became more extreme, from Davis and May into the present real extremists, then I think that has become completely impossible, because they do not wish anything other than their type of very hard Brexit. And what we saw, I think, in hindsight now, is May being pushed into that position by the right-wing extremists. And then when her time was done and they couldn't get any more out of her, they put even harder line people in place to do it. And Johnson is again being pushed or willingly being driven, probably willingly being driven into the most extreme position. So the potential was there. It was never exercised.
So I suppose the only question for me following on from that is about whether any shred of potential still exists going forward. Talking about how things have been in the past with the intergovernmental relationship is, it's all well and good, and people will have their own analysis. But we are where we are now, and we need to think about what is going to happen. You began your opening remarks by saying there is a complete deadlock and mismatch between the UK and EU positions. Is that also the case between the Scottish and UK positions? Is there any potential, if there was a change of attitude from the UK government in terms of their willingness to talk, is there any potential for overlap between the positions being taken by the two governments? Or are you offering us a counsel of despair and simply saying this is being done to us and there is nothing can be done in between these two government positions?
I think the implications that I believe is that we need to continue and intensify that word again, the work that we've been doing on independence, because clearly the UK has not moved in any meaningful way, any way at all, to look at compromise, which we had sought. And indeed, when we suspended our work on independence to face the COVID crisis, we did so, there was no quid pro quo, but we did so, I think, understanding that the UK government was also fully focused on COVID. Actually, one of the big impacts you could have on the economy without risking anything to do with the R number would be to accept an extension. And the fact that they have refused to do so indicates to me that compromise that we have taken in order to try and ensure that all our resources in COVID is something we will need to revisit. Now, that's very hard to do because we are far from over in the COVID crisis and we need to focus on saving people's lives. But I think I would be wrong not to indicate that we are undoubtedly in a position where there is a deadlock, just as there is between the UK and the EU. If there was change to be had, then we might be able to find some means of continuing to discuss these issues, and that's why Jeremy Miles and I have written to Michael Gove with, I think, the minimum proposals that might achieve that. Do I expect the UK to change? No, I don't. And therefore, I think inexorably we are moving towards a position where we will have to renew and accelerate the work we have been doing.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now move to Gordon Lyndhurst, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Cabinet Secretary, good morning. And I want to ask about the discussions about the extension possibility that you raised. Can you tell the committee or advise the committee what proposals were put on the table by the Scottish Government specifically with regard to financial provision in the event of an extension being sought or entered into?
Well, that is already dealt with in the withdrawal agreement, as no doubt you know. The withdrawal agreement indicates that if an extension is sought, that extension can be sought on the basis of an agreed financial contribution. The EU has made it clear that agreed financial contribution would be a continuation of the same. There's been ludicrous figures from Michael Gove about what it would cost. The reality is that an extension would be an extension. It would be a continuation of paying the costs that are paid now. That would be, by many times cheaper than the cost of the financial disaster we are entering into. So, I mean, I believe that Alistair Jack, if I remember correctly, was it Alistair Jack who raised this? Somebody raised this at the last JMC, and he clearly hadn't read the withdrawal agreement, but I'm sure you have.
Well, I think your comments about financial disaster going forward and so forth are speculation. I mean, what we do know is the EU has now set its budget going forward. And what we're looking at is, for example, a country like Germany, 42% increase in its contributions. That's an increase of 13 billion euros a year, up to a total of 30 billion euros. That's just one country's contribution. It's not just because we're leaving the EU. Talk about net figures, perhaps fairer, 8 to 8.5 billion a year. So if we look at the UK contribution and the cost of the extension, I think Dominic Raab, September last year, said it would be about £1 billion a month. BBC Reality Check, self-styled Reality Check, said net that would be about 744 million a month. So if we take 8% of that, that's £60 million a month. Did you say to the UK government you would be quite happy for £60 million a month or some other figure to be reduced from the Scottish budget to enable an extension to be granted?
Well, let's look at what any increase, and of course, I go back to the withdrawal agreement, which is what we need to do because the withdrawal agreement is a binding international treaty. I go back to the withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement indicates there should be negotiation upon that, and the presumption would be that would be based on what is already being paid. But then let's look at what any increase would be about. A very substantial part of any increase will be about the costs of COVID. Now, I don't expect the Scottish budget to be reduced to meet the costs of COVID. If you are suggesting that, that would be a very interesting position for the Scottish Conservatives to take. What is happening with the costs of COVID is that additional money is having to be sourced, borrowed, raised by bonds in order to meet what I think for the UK, and I would have to go and check the figures, is a couple of £100 billion for that cost. So the question might be, would it be better to spend some of that money, a very small part of it, by your indication, even if it were £1 billion a month, a very small part of that overall cost, working with others and taking advantage of a much bigger pot in order to help to meet the cost of COVID? For example, there is to be a new, I think, €14 billion health fund, which is devoted to the type of research on COVID which we desperately need. So would it be better to participate in that way, or would it be better to go on borrowing without that participation? So that would be a judgment to be reached. I wouldn't accept it for a moment any budget should be reduced. What is the question is effective spending. And I would have thought that if that was to be in the end of the discussion that took place, the effective outcomes of that would be substantially better than doing it alone. Let's look backwards to the fiasco of the UK refusing to take part in joint procurement of PPE. We see how foolish that was for ideological reasons. I'm sure you're not suggesting to me that the UK government, for ideological reasons, should choose not to spend money wisely to get the best return from it.
Thank you very much, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues, and
Morning.
good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Returning to one of the key issues, the intergovernmental aspects. Can the Cabinet Secretary just clarify? So, just taking, for example, the most recent events, the most recent UK-EU negotiation round. Was there any briefing in advance of that to the Scottish Government? Was there any debrief? When is the next round? Has any information been forthcoming as to what's going to happen at the next round? What the UK's position is? What is happening? Why is Scotland being locked out? It seems completely.
Well, let me deal with three things. There are three parts to that question, so let me deal with the three things. First of all, we know what the next rounds are to be. This was published before we had the information, but we know what the next rounds should be. There will be what they call a restricted round in the format of a meeting of the chief negotiators and the specialist sessions, 29th June to 3rd of July in Brussels. Now, these are all given locations now because they're trying to move on from video conference to face-to-face discussion, though there's a little caveat at the end of the paper on this, which talks about prevailing health conditions. The week of 6th July is in London, chief negotiators team specialist sessions. The same again, a week of 13th July in Brussels. Same again, week of 20th July, sort of wind up the week of 27th July in London, and then around 6th, 17th of August to 21st of August. Now, so these are a series of meetings that are planned. We presume they will go across the tables, as they're called, and the details of the tables are published. So, to your second question, I think the problem is that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are being treated as if they are stakeholders. They're not being treated as if they're governments of part of the four countries of the UK, and that's very obvious. Some of the language that is used in that way, and there doesn't seem to be any recognition that the devolved governments are responsible for items that are being discussed at the table. Or if there is a recognition, then that is trumped essentially by their view that international relations are reserved and therefore they have total control of international relations. Now, as we know, this is a bit of a grey area. Although international relations are reserved, some of the work within international relations is devolved. So a sensible and mature approach to this from the very beginning would have been to say, look, we don't agree on this. We'll never agree on whether Brexit should or not. Let's first of all seek a way to try and get a compromise solution. May should have done that in 2016, 2017. She might have been able to do it where there was an agreement on what it looked like. Remember that the Single Market Customs Union exclusion was not an exclusion until the Mansion House speech, I think. So there were 6 months in which that was still being discussed. If May had put that in place, then we would have been able to put in place a structure that allowed the devolved administrations to be part of the discussions on areas of devolved competence. I mean, none of us would have ended up with everything we wanted, but all of us would have ended up with something. What is happening now is a very small group of people are determined to get everything they want, and they don't want anybody to have anything else. That's the bottom line here, and that's where things are going.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. I take it, therefore, that it's the same approach, disregarding the devolved settlement with regard to the current ongoing bilateral trade talks, for example, with the US, with Australia and with New Zealand. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could comment on that. And I would just pose the question in general sense, what happened, therefore, to the respect agenda? Should this not be called the disrespect agenda? And of course, we should recall in this regard that we were told in 2014 by those advocating a no vote that we should not leave the UK, we should lead the UK. How does what's happening now as a matter of practical daily business sit with that proclamation?
Well, of course, you're right. I mean, there is no respect agenda. I mean, that's long gone. And lead not leave is not even a joke now. I mean, it's just a distant memory that there were people who said that, and presumably they meant at the time, but there's no evidence of it happening at all. Quite the reverse. I think I wouldn't dwell on that. Frankly, that is in the past. But people should understand that the promises that were made to them have not been honoured. The promises of 2016 have not been honoured. There was there were leaflets with a Michael Gove's face on them, I think, and Boris Johnson's face on them. Talking about the way in which the Scottish Parliament would be have its powers enhanced. It has not happened. The opposite has happened. That's not for debate. That's actually true. So what we need to say is, you cannot trust the people we've been dealing with on this, regrettably, and therefore we just have to be honest about it. You make an interesting point about the trade bill. First, there's a lot of overblown hype about this. I've indicated, the New Zealand situation. It is zero impact upon GDP. I won't use the exact words that a former Australian Prime Minister used. They tend to have more robust language, more robust parliamentary language than we have. But it is quite clear that, again, that is foolish. And to see, I just have to see the Prime Minister waving a packet of Australian chocolate biscuits yesterday. And saying what a huge advantage this would be to be able to buy, I believe they're called Tim Tam chocolate biscuits. Words should fail us to see that happening. They really should. But that's where we are. That's the stock in trade of the current Prime Minister. But there are very interesting and important issues in the trade bill. We cannot accept a trade bill which will be the underpinning legislation that does not recognise, first of all, the legitimate rights of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly in these matters, and in terms of how these matters are dealt with, and secondly, a modern approach to trade negotiations. What we have at the moment is a sort of race to the bottom on trade negotiations. What we need to have is a recognition that trade negotiations are about raising standards, not lowering standards. That's what's happening globally. That responsible nations are saying we need to recognise issues of environment and climate change and non-discrimination. These things need to be put into the system. That's not what is taking place. So I'm very sceptical as to whether we can in any way support what is happening in the trade bill, and that will be a matter to discuss with the Trade Minister. I'm sure you will want to do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Beatrice Wishart to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned in your evidence earlier that you were of the impression that the UK is asking for a low deal and referred to it as a rudimentary deal, and we obviously had warnings before about what a no deal would mean. What's the Scottish Government doing to prepare for a no deal? And given all that's happened with businesses and governments over the last 6 months, are there any particular areas that might be more vulnerable now than they were 6 months ago? I'm thinking of supply chains.
It's a very good question. The pandemic has, to some extent, meant that we have had to essentially test in extreme conditions some of the assumptions that we were making about supply chains and how they would operate. And I think we have learnt from that. And therefore, there would be, I think, more experience going into this, both for ourselves and actually for retailers. I don't know what the situation was in Shetland, but I know that in my own constituency of Garden Butte, there were issues in terms of some parts of the supply chain not delivering at the end of that supply chain to remote communities, and I think we've learned some things about that. But I think I have made it clear in recent days, I think I made it clear in my statement to the Chamber when I spoke last week, that we will be standing up our no-deal arrangements again. We have to do that. It's very hard with all the focus on COVID, but we have to do that. And we have to move forward then on those arrangements. We will also need to revisit and publish shortly our continuity bill, the revised continuity bill that will allow us to ensure that we are able to keep pace with European law in areas that we do so. So the things that we were putting in place for a no deal, which we stood down when a deal was reached, will have to be stood up again. and some of them will be applicable to a low deal. I mean, if there are tariffs, that will have significant effect. If there are, the announcement last week that there would be a light touch on imports was again, showmanship. It is a policy full of holes. Many in Brussels think it's just a distraction, and it will lead to greater problems. So all that will have to be factored in as well, if that is in the end what takes place. So we are starting to stand up again on no deal preparations. Regrettably, it's a real problem given we're still in the midst of a pandemic, but we'll have to do so.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, it just seems difficult to believe that the work on leaving the EU and managing COVID can continue with one without affecting each other. Based on your experience, do you think that this is possible? Do you think that the two issues can be handled simultaneously with no detriment to either outcome?
I have to say to you that we will do our very best to make sure that that is the case. You're absolutely right. The only rational approach to this was for the UK government to say, look, we have to take the pressure out of the system somehow. And here is a way in which we can do it. And as I said, a way that can do something for the economy, at least to remove a threat to the economy without impacting on the R number. It is reckless. It is wrong to have done what they have done. There is no reason for it, except, as I say, either ideological or some people stand to gain from it. And in these circumstances, we will have to do what we need to do. But I admit to you, I worry about it, and I think we would all worry about it because it's not what we should be doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener. I actually do welcome on this occasion the Cabinet Secretary's relentless positivity because I feel he's let the cat out of the bag in stating that he does believe a deal is possible, it's just not a deal that he likes. And on that basis, is it not just better, if we're all interested in being honest, to admit that we do have a UK position as far as is possible, and that is a position that the UK government won a mandate on a UK-wide general election that's going to deliver a Brexit that's meaningful to the millions, not a small group, the millions of people across the United Kingdom who want to get out of the EU.
I fear there can be no meeting of minds between myself and Mr. Bell. I mean, we start with the basic definition of mandate. Those who stood in Scotland stood on a clear mandate. I think that resulted in the loss of all but a handful of Tory seats, and the result that my own party, which stood on the policy of no Brexit, had an overwhelming number of seats. I think the reality is that the difference between a low deal and no deal is hardly any difference at all. I am pointing to an action which can be taken, which continues Brexit, regrettably, but takes a sensible and pragmatic view of what has happened with COVID. And I think Oliver Mundell needs to look around him, at the businesses in his own constituency, and as I look at the businesses in my constituency, and say, what can we do to help? We're working flat out to try and assist. We're working flat out to try and bring hope of recovery. And what can we do to assist more? Well, one of the things we could do is to say, look, we're not going to add an additional burden to you over the next 4 to 5 months. We're not going to add an additional depression on the GDP. We're going to pause and be sensible. But I don't expect us to agree on this because I'm trying to struggle with the practical outcomes of a set of decisions which are wrong. I'm not trying to defend an ideological position which is deeply damaging and for which Scotland did not, in the majority, vote, as we know.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that position, but I'm very confident in going back to my voters at the 2021 election. I'm confidently stating that I've done everything I can to deliver a Brexit that works for the whole of the United Kingdom. And I think those same businesses and individuals in my community will be alarmed to hear the Cabinet Secretary's answer to Patrick Harvey today talking about ramping up and restarting a campaign for independence that would do them an incredible amount of damage. I think it's better just to admit and be honest about the fact that there are fundamental political differences between the UK government and the Scottish government, and not try to find any axes to grind as a result. I think the Scottish government's position is well known. I think it has been listened to, but it is impossible to compromise if you think that the compromise is suboptimal. And I think that I'd be very interested to know what the Cabinet Secretary feels that there's to be gained from an extension if we're just going to continue on this basis where there's a clear impasse not just between the UK government and the EU, between the Scottish government and the UK government. What is there to be gained from continuing this circus any longer?
I have to say that hearing Manuel saying he looks forward to go back to his constituency and say to his voters, I tend to work with all my constituents, not just those who voted for me. But I'm interested in him to go back and say to them in those immortal words, I think, from Citizen Smith, good news, comrade, the butter ration has been cut. Good news, voters, the rest of the UK is going to be fine. I just think that's nonsense, and it's also nonsense that the rest of the UK will be fine. I think there's no doubt that this is going to be damaging. As I say, it is probably likely that they're trying to hide the damage under the extraordinary damage of COVID, which I think is absolutely dishonest and really, really appalling. But the choice is: do you accept this? Do you simply accept that this is an inevitability, and impoverishment, further economic damage, isolation are all going at an acceptable price for saying the rest of the UK voted for this? They didn't, of course. And indeed, rather interestingly, opinion polls have shown, I think for the last year, more than a year, that if it was rerun, people would actually vote against it. Now they've got wise to the ideological nonsense. But all I'm saying in these circumstances is that's a debate you could continue to have. By insisting upon doing it now, by insisting on refusing the extension that is available, damage will be added to damage. Recklessness is added to recklessness. Bankruptcy will be added to bankruptcy. And that will be upon the heads of those who have not stood back and said, in the name of God, don't be stupid.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson, MSP.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I think it's quite clear from this morning's discussions that Scotland has been treated very shabbily, and I was just quite astonished to hear Oliver Mundell talking about axes to grind when the Cabinet Secretary is clearly doing all he can to represent Scotland's best interests. Now, in his letter to the committee of 26th of May, the Cabinet Secretary says, and I quote, "It is inevitable at the end of transition will come when the economy is still reeling from the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. I believe it is reckless to knowingly inflict this damage on an already fragile economic recovery when it can easily be avoided." And we've discussed some of that today. Now, Gary Gillespie advised the committee last year that the impact of Brexit before any pandemic was known about would be 8% to 2030. The Conservatives thought that was scaremongering until the Treasury said it was 8.1%. So I'm just wondering what assessment has actually been carried out now on the back of COVID. I realise things are very much in flux, but to see what additional damage the Scottish Government anticipates will be done at the Scottish economy and what that means for real lives, people's jobs and communities here in Scotland.
As the member will be aware, we published last week a paper which looked at the cumulative damage that would take place when you put COVID and Brexit together, and then how this runs forward. And we also looked at some of the sectors that were likely to be worst affected and indicated what we thought the outcomes would be. Now, we took as conservative a stance, and I used it with a small c as we possibly could. And we want to be accurate about this, but I would allow the paper to speak for itself. But clearly, the overall outcome of that is that if you add, Brexit to COVID, then the recovery from COVID is very much slower and is very much less complete. And in those circumstances, you can you can't mitigate fully the outcome of the COVID recession, but you can avoid adding to it a further 1 to 2% fall in GDP. Now, what does that mean? It means, Mr. Gibson, you and I, have substantial tourism industries in our constituencies. They are really going through the mill, and there are redundancies in large-scale enterprises, and small-scale enterprises are struggling to survive. What it means is that becomes harder for them. The available money for people to spend in those establishments becomes less, and there are fewer people likely to be travelling. And it essentially means that some businesses which might get through COVID, particularly with substantial help, just won't, because the Brexit recession will be the final straw. Then if you look at manufacturing businesses, if you look at export, then you look at them and say that becomes progressively more difficult. I go back to the announcement that Michael Gove made last week about imports. Imports isn't really the issue. Making imports easier may well make the task of business harder. It also makes fraud more likely. But in all those circumstances, nothing that I have heard that is being proposed for Brexit makes the position of business any easier, and all of it makes it more difficult.
Yes, I appreciate that making imports easier, it doesn't do us a lot of good if it doesn't make exports any easier, because we really don't then have a balanced playing field. You mentioned sectors, as indeed did Beatrice Wishart earlier on, and you talked about how our own constituencies be hit. Seymour Hydro in my own constituency announced it was going out to consultation on 200 redundancies only yesterday, and that's a hotel that's been there since 1880. So geographically, how will Scotland be particularly hit by Brexit, in addition to the impact on tourism and agriculture? If there are any other geographic areas where the Scottish Government is particularly concerned about, and also what, if anything, can be done to mitigate by the Scottish Government?
Yeah, the mitigation is about mitigating the effects of a particular deal or no deal. So that is what you have to do. You have to estimate what the effects would be of a low deal or a no deal, and if it wishes, ask specifically about a no deal, and then you have to see what you can do to keep things flowing, to keep supplies flowing, to look at issues of medicine, to make sure you do all those things. So there's a mitigating action. Just in terms of places that are most likely to be damaged, there's been a lot of work on this done before the COVID epidemic, admittedly. Some work done on worst affected cities. There's a correlation, of course, between poverty and damage. The poorest will suffer most, undoubtedly. But there's also, we shouldn't take aside tourism or agriculture or fisheries, because there are sectors which will suffer particularly too. Then you add in some very specific additional issues. Now, I raised at the very beginning of this the involvement in programs. If the UK is not going to be a full participating member of Horizon Europe, for example, then the implications for higher education and research are very, very substantial indeed. And we know that. Now, higher education is already taking a substantial hit from COVID. The latest, I think, from the UK on Horizon was to indicate they thought that it was too expensive, and they were quibbling about whether, if you were a member from a third country, whether you'd be able to take more than one thing. So in these circumstances, that's a sector. So you would be badly affected. So you look at each geographical part of Scotland, and you can see difficulties in rural areas and in cities, and generally poverty and affluence are factors in there. You look at issues of sectors, and you get the indication of where the most damage will be. Nobody would be left unscathed by a no deal or a low deal Brexit. For a long period of time. This is a walking away from something, an arrangement, to be blunt, that has helped to guarantee peace and prosperity in our continent for the last 50, 60 years, and certainly in our membership for almost 50 years. You can't walk away without an impact. And you know that because there was an impact when you joined. One of the interesting things about this is you can actually see the effect in the figures of when the UK joined the old European Union, because there was an improvement in GDP, and you saw a growth over a period of time in the standard of living. And if you leave, that will be reversed, and no amount of dissembling about trade deals with Australia and New Zealand will make any difference.
Yes, finally, Convener, with your indulgence, I'll just move on to one other area, but I just want to say that clearly with Brexit coming up, there will be real concerns about confidence within the economy, which will impact, of course, on consumption, demand and unemployment going forward. But the issue I want to touch on is one that the Cabinet Secretary himself just mentioned a minute ago, which is about the social impact of the European Union in terms of security. Now, what has the Scottish Government now advised on where we are in terms of ensuring that security cooperation will continue, and also work with regard to police cooperation? Because obviously organised crime is a major issue across Europe, and there are concerns that there will be damage to work in that particular area as we go forward if a deal is not done.
Well, there are a number of means of cooperation, and organisations that bring us into cooperation with EU countries. There are particular tools we use. The European arrest warrant is one of them, which have been very valuable to Scottish law enforcement. That is up in the air. That remains up in the air. And it is a truism of any negotiation to say that nothing is agreed until all is agreed. There is no agreement on how these things go forward. And without access, for example, to databases, things like the Schengen database, we have a huge set of issues for law enforcement, which will be inevitably more difficult. International law enforcement will be more difficult. Extradition will be more difficult. The real problem with this is there's no reason why that should be the case. Even if there was an acceptance that membership of the EU was not what should take place, and I don't accept that, but if there was that acceptance, there was open to the UK to membership of the single market and customs union, arrangements through EFTA and EEA that would have guaranteed a closer relationship but not membership. But the ideological obsession, which has been interpreted in this discussion by Oliver Mundell as an absolutist position, that when you have voted for Brexit, you have voted for the hardest, harshest, most complete, most utter break, then if that is what the UK government is pursuing as it is inevitable that on a whole range of important issues, including that vital issue of policing and security, we will be in a worse position.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you very much. We have a little time in hand for supplementary questions. If members want to press the R button in the chat function, I'd be happy to bring them in. Cabinet Secretary, if I could go back to the beginning of March, it seems a long time ago now, we had the Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack in front of the committee, and I pressed him at some length about whether the UK government had done any modelling on the economic impact of the deal that they were pursuing in the talks. Of course, they haven't. It was only the modelling that had been done some time ago that showed that a Canada-style deal would have resulted in a 6.2% fall in GDP, which was a Treasury analysis. But he said they didn't, at the moment, have any modelling being done. However, Nick Leake, his official, said, we will invite contributions on the economic implications of the future relationship from a variety of stakeholders via a public consultation. Are you aware of any public consultation being organised by the UK government?
I'm afraid I'm not. I've heard nothing about it. I won't say definitively that no such consultation exists, but I know nothing about it. It's like the supposed consultation on the Shared Prosperity Fund. It has been a consultation much discussed, but I've never seen it, and I think this is the problem. There's a lot of promises of consultation and discussion. It's at the root of the problem we're talking about today. There's a constant mantra from UK ministers that they are listening to devolved administrations, they're consulting them. There may be a lot of verbiage. There's nothing meaningful, and there's nothing that's going to produce an outcome or a result, and that's probably the same here.
I think the other thing I wanted to say was going back to Oliver Mundell's point about the political differences between the UK and the Scottish Government, and a point that was made by Mr Rycroft giving evidence to us a couple of weeks ago. It struck me, obviously, your joint statement and the letter you referred to is between yourselves and the Welsh Labour government, who represent a country who actually voted for Brexit. So how much of the the difference is political and how much of it is structural in terms of how the UK works? And can I also ask you, have you been able to get any impression from the Northern Ireland government since it's been back up and running as to how they view the whole structure of intergovernmental relations?
Well, I mean, quite clearly, the Northern Ireland and Welsh governments can and will speak for themselves, and I can't speak for them. I can talk about my own experience. And at the end, this comes down to a respect agenda, the respect for the governments and the countries and their voters. Oliver Mundell raised the issue of mandate. When the first JMC that was held after the election last December, I mean, I made it very clear to Michael Gove and to I recognised the mandate that the UK government got to leave the EU. But I asked for a mutual recognition of the mandate that the Scottish government had to pursue the issue of a referendum. I thought that was a fair thing to do, and it seems in democratic theory absolutely unexceptional to recognise those mandates. The UK government recognises its own mandate and insists upon it. It rejects any mandate from anybody else in terms of how these matters should go forward. And that it cannot stand. In the end, that cannot stand because that position is profoundly undemocratic. And it doesn't matter whether it's being espoused by an academic or whether it's being espoused by the Secretary of State for Scotland or Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster or the Prime Minister. It is simply a democratic outrage to recognise only your own mandate and to refuse to recognise anybody else's. So I recognise the mandate of the Government of Wales. I've had lots of very productive and sensible discussions, both with the current First Minister and with my present counterpart, Jeremy Miles. We do not agree on destination, but we do agree that people have the right to choose. And that's the basis of the Welsh Government's published position on what the UK should do. I think I quote, well, I summarise something that Mark Drakeford has said regularly, which is he believes in the United Kingdom because he believes there are advantages for each side. If that were not the case, he would not believe it, right? Now, I believe presently there are no such advantages, and this illustrates there are no such advantages, and I see nothing that contradicts that, but we come to a different conclusion. That is an honest position. But we've been able to work on it because we've seen it closely at first hand, how the UK government has treated both of us. And I think that is very clear.
Thank you very much. We do have a number of members who wish to ask supplementary questions. So I'm going to bring in Annabel Ewing, followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener, for letting me back in. An issue we've not touched this week, but we spent quite a bit of time last week and indeed previous weeks, concerns, of course, the fishing industry. And I had put to Elspeth MacDonald from the SFF last week, reminding everybody, of course, that on our way into the EC, as then was, our fishing industry was still the river in terms of the Whitehall papers that showed that it was deemed to be expendable. Elspeth indicated that the SFF have very long memories indeed, and they will not be assured on this point until, I think she said, they see the ink dry on any deal, because of course the suggestion is from some in Brussels that the UK, of course, will seek to trade away once again Scotland's fishing interests for some deal on some other issues. Could the Cabinet Secretary comment?
Yes, I mean, I think we should not fall into the error, and I'm sure you don't, I mean, particularly your knowledge of this, that there is only one fishing industry in Scotland. There are various parts of the fishing industry in Scotland, and they have different views. For example, in my own area, there is a very substantial fear that exporting will be severely hit by the imposition of any tariffs and or the imposition of a phytosanitary inspection, which will be very, very difficult to cope with any volume of export. So there are worries and issues in there. But I think what we're beginning to see is some of the bones of where the argument lies on the fisheries issue. And it must be worrying for the Scottish fishing industry, because they are, as I previously said, the only part of this argument to which the Tory government ever refers in terms of Scotland. And I disagree with the position of the UK government, but I also disagree with some of the things that the EU are saying. And we want to move this to a better place. There are some essentials in there. Scottish fishing must not be in a worse position than it is now. That sounds axiomatic, but actually we've got to make sure that that happens, because the fishing industry, are right to say, remembers when they were made many promises and found themselves, if I may use the phrase, sold down the water pretty quickly thereafter. So, absolutely, they must not be in a worse position. There has to be a recognition of historical rights, but there has to be, all history has to be revisited from time to time. There has to be a recognition of the change that's taking place. That is absolutely essential. The devolved administrations have a dominant interest, particularly Scotland. The recognition of that dominant interest has not been paid sufficient attention to, and that needs to happens. And there needs to be compliance built in a way that all of us are happy with the way in which the science is applied, and all of us are happy with the shared responsibility we have, primary responsibility in the devolved nations and wider responsibility in these islands. So there are issues that we can see resolved, but the UK has to accept that there are rights for Scotland and for other countries that have to be baked into this as well. So I think there's a possibility of a resolution, but I don't think that the UK will get one unless that it is in a position to recognise the special rights of Scotland, and also unless it's in a position to recognise that it must not sell out Scotland again, as its tendency has been.
Thank you. Thank you. Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. I think Scottish fishermen and the members of the SFFO have a long memory when it comes to seeing their government here in Scotland push to keep them trapped in the common fisheries policy past January next year. But I wanted to ask, the Cabinet Secretary talks a lot about respect, but is he willing to admit that he doesn't respect the fact that the UK government has a responsibility to all citizens of the United Kingdom, and in these matters it acts on behalf of the whole of the United Kingdom? And does he think that his language in particular around David Frost today suggests any respect from the Scottish Government for the lead negotiator for the United Kingdom?
Well, let me deal with all 3 points. 2 of them are misrepresenting what I said, and one of them is, I think, democratically flawed. But let's deal with them all. First of all, on David Frost, I've said to David Frost, because I've known him for a long time, I said to him at the last JMC, that whilst I disagreed with the United Kingdom government on the issues of Brexit, I deplored the language of his letter to Michel Barnier. I've said it publicly too, and I'm saying it again now. I do deplore it, and I disassociate myself from it. I don't think it helps the situation. And I think there are democratic issues about accountability which are tied up with the Brexit process now and with the lack of scrutiny. So I'm not saying anything that I haven't said elsewhere. I'm sure, I've chatted to David Frost over the years. I've no objection to him, but I have the very strongest objection both to the structure that has been established and also to the way in which that letter was written, and I think it was wrong. So no difficulty there. Sorry?
It's not exactly giving him your fullest support at a difficult point in the negotiations.
No, I do not give him my fullest support. I give him my honest opinion. That is what I am there to do, and that is what I'm trying to do on behalf of Scotland. That is a basic in my position and the position of any negotiator. Secondly, I did not, and I'm not pushing, and you're wrong about this, to keep the people, the fishermen of Scotland in the common fisheries policy. I'm trying to get, if there is negotiation, a sensible outcome from the negotiations. I do think it is, a serious risk that the Conservative government in the UK will sell out the Scottish fishermen as they have done in the past. I also think that it does not help anybody if the only issue on which the Scottish Conservatives and the Conservatives wish to argue this is on the basis of fisheries. It does indicate, perhaps, that on every other issue they realise that they are hiding to nothing. And finally, I mean, this is a basic question, and you and I disagree on it, but let's be straight about the disagreement. I do not believe that the people of Scotland should be disadvantaged and impoverished simply to allow the UK government to say we've done this on behalf of the whole of the UK. I believe there should be a mutual recognition of mandates. And if there was that mutual recognition of mandates, we would not be having this disagreement and we would not be having this argument. We would be in a basic democratic position, which is the norm elsewhere. There is one mandate and another mandate. The fact that a Conservative MSP can shake their head at that, I think, makes me worried about Scottish conservatism, because it does not appear to be grounded in basic democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. Stuart McMillan, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you wrote to the committee on the 26th of May, and part of that letter was focused on the new protocol with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and it's clear that there will be some additional costs will come from that particular protocol that will certainly affect the Scottish Government budget. Have you been given any confirmation from the UK Government that they will actually pay the Scottish Government additional resources to actually deal with these costs?
I know the convener asked for short answers. I'll give you a very short one. No. None at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The 2016 EU referendum wasn't cast in stone, and a survey by Focal Data just published today suggests that 83% of people in Scotland and 77% in the UK want transition to be extended. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government should recognise that? And also, the IMF has said that GDP in the UK will be cut by 3.5% through Brexit, and that CBI is of the view that this will block economic recovery. And lastly, what does he think about the UK Government's £4.5 million shock and awe advertising campaign, which it plans to launch as transition ends to promote Brexit?
I saw the report last night, and there's further details coming out today of this advertising campaign. I'm not surprised, but it is utterly distasteful, to use language, appalling language of, military strength in order to describe how you would influence your fellow citizens to do something that is, positively harming to them. It just revolts you to think that this is taking place. In terms of referenda, the Tories insist that the outcome of 2014 and 2016 are the guiding stars of whatever we do. And they seem to be unable to recognise that, as times change, things change. There are a number of famous quotations on that. But, if the evidence proves you wrong, then you should accept that and look at what the evidence tells you now. The evidence tells us that people want to have a chance to choose from a very different set of options in terms of independence, because in 2014 they were not told the truth about membership of the EU, and there is also no status quo now. The status quo has gone. It is a choice between the type of low deal or no deal Brexit Britain, which we see emerging before us, or independent membership of the EU. That's the choice, and that's clearly the choice. And people looking at the 2016 result recognise that they were a pig in a poke, and they also want to revisit that. So I think, as a Democrat, I can see things around me changing. I talk to people, as we all talk to people, and I think that we need to recognise people deserve the right to choose and have asked for the right to choose. As for the figures, I don't think anybody could dispute the harm that's going to come out of this. Nobody. And I think if we're honest about that, it dictates what we should do next.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for coming today. The one area we've not really touched on in any depth is the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the committee has had quite an in-depth look at that, and we have visited South West Scotland in particular to talk to people there about the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Are you able to give us any indication of the nature of your engagement with the UK Government on the implication of the protocol and what its economic effects in particular might be for Scotland, and particularly for the southwest of Scotland?
I think the committee has, I know, looked at this closely. There are a variety of issues on the protocol to which we must be engaged. The rules to determine which goods enter Northern Ireland, whether they be subject to tariffs, administrative and infrastructure requirements on the Scottish side, fisheries arrangements, agriculture and VAT issues, a whole range of things that we need to talk about. This was recognised very clearly by the Northern Ireland administration when they rejoined the JMC process at the beginning of this year, and indeed they proposed that the JMC held in Cardiff on the 9th of January that there be a new work stream established in the JMC-EN that brought together all the devolved administrations with the UK government to discuss this. This was accepted. It hasn't happened. I think it was raised again in officials' meeting this week, and we think it may get started, but we will have to look at all these things together and to discuss how these things will affect all of us. There remains a fear in the EU and elsewhere that the UK is doing its best to avoid implementing things. I don't think there is the slightest doubt that if that were in the end to be the case, that would mean no deal was possible. I have to say I'm always struck, and I have many conversations with people in Europe and elsewhere, I am always struck how this is the real touchstone, that if the UK were to renege on an agreement, particularly one to do with Northern Ireland, then they could not expect to have any deal of any description.
Right. Well, that is very worrying. I noticed that the Spectator, which has got quite close channels with Number 10, was speculating that the UK government really wanted a no deal and that COVID provided a cover for that to happen. Do you think they're correct?
Well, I think there are various issues in which COVID be a cover. I'm actually looking for something that I think tends to raise a great deal of suspicion. But I think, and let me see if I can find it. But I think there are genuine fear. They are being denied, and I'll be fair to the UK government. They are being denied at the present moment. But there are genuine fears that what will actually take place is a continual weakening of the position on the withdrawal agreement and on the protocol, because there is a resentment about them. The issue of the EU office in Northern Ireland was, I think, an interesting one. This should be utterly non-controversial. There was absolutely no reason why this should not take place, but it became a cause célèbre for the UK government, and I think it allowed them to play to a gallery. The thing I want to draw your attention to is a headline in the Sunday Express 2 weeks ago. Boris wants to fix unfair Brexit deal, says the front page. That's one of those front pages. You get them from time to time that people find out about across Europe, and it raises alarm bells. The unfair Brexit deal is, of course, the deal that he did, which was described as oven ready, and the best deal and the deal he was going to implement. Now, the Express is close to the Tories. If it really is, and we've heard this from others, that in some way the withdrawal agreement and the protocol are unfair, then any attempt to undo them would presumably be popular with those ideologues who are driving the present ship towards the rocks, I have to say, but the ideologues who are steering this present ship. If that is where they were to go, then that would make a deal of any sort with the EU, and not just in my view, in the view of almost all people who know this, impossible to do.
Well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You have kept up your record of rather depressing session with the committee,
Sorry.
I'm afraid. The facts are the facts. So thank you for coming to share your views with us today, and we can now move into private session.
Thank you.
Thank you.